All right, so the doors are closing there in the back, so I guess that means I'm supposed to start. So what do I do and how do I do that? These are all questions that have been asked of me or that I've asked, and it really comes down to how do we mentor the junior developers on your team into productive team members that you know can help your team move forward, can help your company move forward. So my name's Dan Mallott or Daniel Mallott. Either one works. If you say Daniel to my wife, she won't know who you are. But if you say Daniel to lots of my friends, they'll know exactly. So I'm a principal for West Monroe Partners. We're a business and technology consulting firm based out of Chicago in the United States, as you may have guessed from my accent. So I've been in the industry since 2011. I've been leading teams since 2012. A lot of that has happened sort of by accident and organically. More recently, it has become more deliberate. This year, I've managed almost $2 million in projects. That's $2 million US dollars. And most of my teams tend to be made up of less experienced individuals. There's a reason for that. I do staffing for our technology practice, so I get to choose who comes on my teams. And it's one of those things where I'm very passionate about mentoring and teaching and filling in those gaps. And so I say, well, yes, give me these younger, less experienced. I say younger in the industry, less experienced individuals, so that I can hopefully help them move forward. I was a DBA and a developer, mostly a developer now, although it seems like now in my current role mostly I develop PowerPoints. Yeah, some laughter out there. That's that knowing. Yeah, that's kind of true. Laugh. And then in my spare time, I play and referee ice hockey, which is that a thing here? No. Okay. It's that thing you get on the mountains for like a month during the winter, right? Yeah. Well, being in Chicago, we have ice more of the year than we would care to admit. So why is everybody here? Look, as we grow in our career, you end up in a position to manage others, or you expect to end up in a position to manage others, right? Very few of us, no matter what our desires, just get to sit there and write code forever. Maybe your organization hires lots of developers fresh from their degree program, whatever that is. So West Monroe Partners, we are about 1,050 people currently across the United States. We hired 100 new consultants this year. They started a month ago. Of those, 40 of them were in technology, including 10 that are developers and are on developer projects, and guess what? They needed to be productive on day one or soon thereafter. Yeah, so we take them all and throw them in training for 3 weeks and then go, hey, you know how to be a developer now and a consultant, and you know how not to stick your foot in your mouth in front of a client. Good luck. And then the last thing here, you've noticed that you've had an issue with young developers leaving less than 2 years after they get hired. So there's a lot of early turnover. Yeah, somebody comes in, they're there for a year, they seem to be really happy, they seem to be a really good performer, or they are a really good performer, they've proven that out, and then, they leave, and you don't know why, and they give some milquetoast reason to HR. Or sorry, I can't pronounce the H the way you guys do. H, yeah, something like that. HR, human resources. We'll go with that. And they give human resources some milquetoast reason, like, oh well, this was just a better offer, or it's more in line with what I want to do. And you go, well, but you were doing what you wanted to do. That's why you came here in the first place, right? Or the last thing, at least for us, for people who are in software development, software is easy and people are difficult, or people are hard, depending on what adjective. Because people are not binary, right? And now we mean that in many, many senses, but we aren't ones and zeros. You cannot distill us down to that, right? So couple of quick notes before we get too far in here. When I say right in the context of software development, what I mean by that is following the generally accepted best practices and conforming to organizational standards. We all have those, right? Uh-oh. And then need versus want is a sort of tricky concept. Because at least, and this might be a regional thing as well, at least where I am, I get a lot of, well, I really need this. Like, well, do you? Do you actually need this? So for our purposes, a need is anything that absolutely must be fulfilled for progress to occur, okay? So whatever the need is, it must happen, right? Anything less than that is, well, I just want it. Like, you know, if I make a good salary, I might say, well, I need more money, but the truth is I actually want more money. I don't need it. That makes sense. Yeah? Okay. And then last, if you have a question, please feel free to interrupt me at any time during this. I prefer my sessions to be interactive. There are lots of you out there, and there should be time to answer all of your questions, I hope. Okay, so there are some things that we can't solve for as managers, mentors, leaders, coaches, whatever you want to call it. Donna in her previous session said, don't hire a manager, hire leaders. But there are some things that we can't do, right? So in here, we're focused on coaching. There are some things that aren't coachable. So my firm, we call these the brilliant basics. That's certainly not unique to us. So sort of common term. And these are things that anybody can do, no matter how good they are at their actual job. Okay? So effort, this includes effort needed to learn the domain, right? So if any of you came to work for me on my current client, it's an insurance broker in the United States. They do mostly US-based work, at least the part that I'm working with. I would expect you to ask me a bunch of questions about, well, what's actually going on here? Or something that's even more different. My previous client was a healthcare insurer, right? Well, that's pretty different in different parts of the world. If I came here, I would need to ask a lot of questions before I really understood the domain, right? But that doesn't actually affect my ability to write software. It affects my ability to write the right software, but not software in general. Attention to detail and paying attention, those are sort of two sides of the same coin, right? So if you're in a meeting, taking not just notes, but the right notes, being able to distill those down. Showing up on time and dressed appropriately. This one is sort of well, you can't really be employed without doing these things, but neither can we coach that into somebody either. Either they do it or they don't. And then the last one is being willing to accept coaching. So in our organizational structure, we have career advisors and career advisees. So I'm a career advisor to 3 advisees. One of my advisees has a particular problem with that last one where you'll sit there and you'll give him a bunch of feedback and he'll go, okay, yeah, sure. And when you know, 3 weeks later, you're back in there giving him the same feedback because it hasn't, or improved for a little bit and then it went back, or, no improvements happened, right? So how many of you have over 10 years of experience? Right, lots of you, okay. Over 20? All right. Now this is for everybody. Do you remember a particular individual who mentored you early on? Maybe the person you would say is responsible for turning you into the developer you are today. Yeah? Okay, hopefully. Maybe not. And how many of you remember your first task as a professional developer? Yeah, how did you feel? Yeah, the uncomfortable laugh in the front there. So I went to the University of Louisville in Louisville, Kentucky. And after I graduated, I went and joined a company that does medical satisfaction surveys. So If you go and have home health or hospice care, or they've branched out now into some other things, they'll send you a survey and ask how the provider did. Were they friendly? Did they take your needs into account? How was your pain management? Things like that. And at the time that I was hired as part of an effort that was basically changing the engines out on the airplane while the airplane was in the air. So they were rewriting their core platform, but they couldn't stop the business to do it. And they couldn't just do a hard cutover because of the cyclical nature, government regulations, blah, 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 blah. Clients, those things. And so my first task was, hey, we have this scanning machine that scans all these paper surveys that we get in, because we were required to send paper surveys. This was not that long ago, by the way. And supposedly there's this programming interface where we can dump all these survey results to a SQL Server database, or any sort of database. We happen to have SQL Server. Can you do that? Here's some documentation. Here's access to the scanner, the server. Go for it. Oh, and by the way, .NET, C#, T-SQL, and this thing uses some weird VB6 based scripting language. Good luck. Okay. So I went on to actually, make this thing work. It took me about a month. And then I had another 2.5 years of continuing to have to work on it. So this one thing I tell my consultants as an aside is everybody should work in industry at some point, because what happens in industry when you work there for a long time?
Do maintenance.
Yes. You have to own your failures. As a consultant, I get to walk in, write code, and walk away, and it's somebody else's problem. Now, it might still be my firm's problem. It might even still be mine, but hey, I get paid more to fix my problem. When you work in industry and you're the guy, yeah. And so that was a really good introduction to how not to manage people for me. Here's a task. Here's basically zero guidance. Go do it. So it sort of got me interested in learning a bit more about how to mentor. When I was in university, I worked as a tutor, which is basically someone, at least in the United States, that people who take classes come to ask you to do their homework for them. It's a bit like being an in-person Stack Overflow. And so I started becoming more interested in mentoring, and to the point where when I was applying for my current job at a somewhat lower role, they were asking me some leadership questions, and I got asked the most interesting question in an interview I've ever been asked. Because I talked about, leading junior developers and saying, hey, maybe, sometimes they're going to fail, and sometimes you have to let them, or maybe you don't want to let them, and the interviewer asked me, is it ever okay to let someone fail? And I said, well, yes. Now, there are a whole bunch of caveats around that, right? There's time, budget, what's the context of failure? Is somebody going to die because they fail? But that's where some of it is failure-based, right? So sometimes it's okay to let people fail. It's okay to say, well, I told you to do it this way, you didn't do it this way, and now it failed, and you do it without being that kind of annoying person. So let's talk about some mentoring basics. So these are things you have to do when you first get a new junior developer, whether it's to your organization or on your team, because those two things may not happen at the same time depending on your structure, and if you're consulting, there's some matrixy stuff going on. Hopefully you've gotten to interview this person, maybe not. So understand and respect their background. This is the most important thing, okay? And it's, sometimes we talk about this like with diversity or bias or some of these other things, but really it comes down to the person who just joined your team is different than you are, okay? So they're gonna have a different educational background, right? They might not have computer science or computer engineering degrees. They might have graduated from a coding boot camp. Are those a thing here? Yeah, okay. They might not even have a degree at all, right? Is there anybody in the room who's self-taught, no degree? Awesome. Mad respect for you. And it's pretty likely your junior developer is not going to share your whatever demographic categorization there is, gender, race, age bracket, Star Wars versus Star Trek preference. Okay, not to start a holy war in the room. So take some time to understand where they came from. So both personally and professionally, okay? And that could just be like sit down last week. Was it last week? It was last week. Sorry, I was in New York last week and then back to Chicago and now I'm here and then I'll be in Germany next week. Yeah. Take some time to understand where they came from. So last week I have one of our new developing consultants joined my team. She's supposed to be doing some Power BI work for us. And points to her, she put this on my calendar. Sat down and we talked for a half an hour about nothing about the project, just who each of us were, where we came from, what our backgrounds are, schools. It turns out she grew up not too far from where my wife did, and has similar opinions about that town. And so now I have a better basis to talk to her about whatever, okay? And so that's really important. You have to know your people, okay? Check any preconceived notions at the door. So at least in the Chicago area, there's this sort of stereotype of people who grow up in the rich suburbs, go off to either the University of Illinois or Purdue or maybe the University of Michigan if they want to go kind of far away from home. And then they move into the city, they live in the city for about 10 years, they get married, they have their first kid, and they move back out to the rich suburb where they grew up. Okay, now, for every person that I have met that has fallen into that stereotype, I've met one person who hasn't. So, for example, my wife grew up in a rich suburb, didn't go to the big state school, moved into the city, and we're not moving out of the city anytime soon. Mainly because I don't like driving to work. So I guess traffic's sort of epically bad here in Sydney. Chicago is of a similar level of epic awfulness of traffic. So yeah, check preconceived notions at the door. And that sort of goes with that last one, which is never assume. Yeah, so I don't know if you guys have the same saying here when you assume. Yeah, if you put a couple of spaces in there. Yeah, all right. So you don't have to be best friends with the new developers. You don't have to be best friends with anybody you work with. It's easy. You have a common frame of reference and you spend 40-ish hours a week with them, maybe more. You might see the people you work with more than you see your spouse or your kids. It's a little scary. But you want to get to know them on something of a personal level. And vice versa, you have to be willing to share with them, okay? So and what this does is it helps establish a trust relationship that's not just what we do at our jobs based. Because knowing what's going on in someone's personal life can help you understand why they're falling short or why they're really doing well, right? And even anticipate time off needs, okay? So for example, my grandmother is 94. At some point, I'm going to get a phone call, hopefully not while I'm here, because that would be a little difficult. Like, hey, you need to fly to Pittsburgh. Now, everybody on my team knows that. It's not like something like, oh, it's a big deal, but it's, hey guys, just so you know, she's headed downhill, this is gonna happen. It doesn't have to be like that. One of my, actually the gentleman who's the lead developer on my current project, his girlfriend lives in New York. He has to go to New York every once in a while, right? Presumably. Yeah. Or, you know, we have another person who has to take care of a member of his family. And he's been on projects with me for about 15 months now. He can't travel all the time. So, you know, it's understanding that. And then understanding what they want out of their personal life can help you understand what they want out of their career and how to temper their expectations. So if you work in industry, this may not be such a big thing, because generally you go to an office, you do your work, and you go home, and there's not a ton of travel necessarily involved. Sometimes you might get to a place where you're managing people in multiple different locations. So for example, my wife worked for a biofuel company that they had offices in Chicago, Auckland, and the middle of nowhere in Georgia, the U.S. state of Georgia. She had to go there. But in consulting, sometimes travel is part of the job, right? How many people here work in consulting? Yeah, a few. Okay. So as a consultant, I have to go where the work is, which can mean somewhere down the street from me or somewhere halfway across the country, halfway across the world. When I have kids, because I don't have any yet, that's going to have to change a bit. And that's a conversation I have to have with my leadership. Likewise, for the people on my team who are junior developers, understanding what they want out of their career. Like, hey, if you want to work long-term at this, well, you're like, let's understand that. Let's understand the impacts on your personal life. Likewise, let's understand how we craft your career to allow you to do what you want to do with your personal life. And understand that you cannot have it all. And then last, make sure that you include them in team and company activities. So say you have, I don't know, I've been on teams where every Friday we go out for a drink after work. Or on my current team, we actually have 3 different teams at this client. Every Thursday we pick a restaurant to all go out, all 3 teams, all like 12 of us, all go out to lunch together. Make sure the newbies are included. Make sure that they understand that they're welcome. And make sure that they understand it's not required for them to come, because that can be a bit intimidating as well. And then lastly, check for understanding. So always check to make sure what you've told your junior developer, your new team member, makes sense to them, okay? So communication is a two-way street. If I say words to you and you don't understand them, whose fault is that? Mine, right? So be prepared to explain using several different examples and methods of teaching. So if the word explanation isn't making it, okay, let's go to a whiteboard. If the whiteboard doesn't make sense, find some different way, okay? And that includes differences in language, right? So I'm sure I've used a few Americanisms so far that nobody understands. So for example, my wife's extended family is from County Clare in Ireland. If we went to County Clare and said, hey, where's the elevator? Well, first of all, they'd say, well, what do we need a lift for? The buildings aren't more than 2 stories high. But they would also look at me a little bit weird and go, well, you're an American and you don't respect our language here. Like, that's not the way we say it. I would probably be able to find someone who literally didn't understand what an elevator was. But if I said lift, they would get it. Does that make sense out there? Yeah, okay. And then that sort of rolls into, there are three basic learning styles that are recognized. And there's a bit of a discussion out there about how true these actually are, and how. So the idea is usually people are better at two of the three. There's research out there that says that's nonsense, but regardless, if you involve all three of these, you're going to get good results. So auditory, which is what I'm doing to you right now, right? Visual, which is what I'm doing to you right now, and kinesthetic, which is the actual doing, which really can't do to you all right now. That would be a little weird. So in a coding landscape, all three of these are pretty easy to involve, right? So I can tell you, hey, use the async await pattern here, make sure that make sure that when you go into the loop, you have a way to reliably break out of it, right? I can draw that up on a board in maybe a sequence diagram, right? Or I can have them do it via a hands-on keyboard code, like, hey, code this out how you think, or like rough this out how you think it should happen, right? Whether it's, the full implementation or not, probably doesn't matter. Make sure that they can explain it back to you, okay? And this becomes a bit more important when you're talking about domain, but I've also seen it fall down with actual coding. So if I tell you how to do something, I'm going to ask, explain that back to me, and without parroting my words back, so without just repeating what I told you. Because if all they do is repeat what I've told them, then I don't know that they've really understood. Whereas if they turn it into their own words, or, hey, explain this to me on a whiteboard, like challenge on a different medium, right? Then I know they understand, okay? Which is important because that means I can walk away and know that they're not going to screw it up in the ways that might be predictable. And then later on, this becomes important or more easy as you've worked with people, is learn to recognize when they're just not getting it. So the lead developer on my team, I've worked with him on and off for about 18 months now, mostly on, just some gaps between projects. And there's a look that he gets when what I'm saying is not registering. And that's my key. That's my, okay, I need to stop. Chris, is what I'm saying making sense? Generally, the answer is no. Okay, where did I lose you? What's going on here? What's not clicking? How can I explain this differently? Learning to code professionally is hard. This one's, well, processes can save you, or at least avoid some common pitfalls. So whether you're on an Agile team or a waterfall team, there's an appropriate place and time to make sure that things are understood. So in an Agile, grooming, tasking, people need to be asking questions. So this goes back to the engagement. If everybody's engaged, they can ask questions, they can clarify, right? You get those things out of the way. On waterfall, spend adequate time up front, right? That's kind of the whole deal there, is you gather all your requirements up front, make sure everything's understood. Yeah, ensure you have coding standards and that they've been communicated. So I worked on a client a couple of years ago where we did a whole bunch of development. We got to the end of the project, and our change advisory board request was rejected. I said, well, why is this rejected? Well, you didn't follow our coding standards. What coding standards? So, on the other hand, at my current client, there's a 50-page document on how to write SSIS. Probably shouldn't have done that on the video. Okay, moving on. Code reviews are really important when you're working with junior developers. Actually, they're really important with everybody, because like I look at code I wrote 3 months ago and go, ooh. But they're really important when you're working with somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience. And just a sort of a quick story here. I was working with, this is a recurring theme, a brand new consultant on a project for a company that did food safety testing. This is kind of important, right? And I had a pretty heavy load of the development, share the development, and I was like, well, I don't really have time to really do an in-depth code review. I'll just kind of look at his pull request and go, okay, well, that makes sense. Looks right. Seems fine. Approved. Yeah. Then the QA person would come back. Hey, this doesn't work. Okay. So, real code reviews are really important. And it does, if you can do it as part of a formal check-in process, whether it's a pull request or, you know, in not VSTS, Azure DevOps. Like some sort of a gated check-in there if you're using TFVC, like great. Informally at the desk is fine. So there are 4 things here. Have them walk you through what they've done, okay? And that's not just like, hey, let me look at the code. It's, hey, talk me through this code, right? Because a lot of times, and this happens to all of us, you'll talk yourself through your code and go, I just found the bug. You know, it's that bit of rubber ducking. Have them demonstrate working code. Does it do what it's supposed to do? In Agile, it's, hey, does it fulfill the acceptance criteria? And that should be able to demo that before you merge that into your develop branch or whatever, your trunk, whatever. Reserve judgment on what they've done until the end. They have likely solved the problem in a way that's different than the way you would have solved it. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It might be wrong. Doesn't mean it's wrong. And then they get to fix their own mistakes. Okay? As human beings, we learn really well through failure, which is kind of a problem, because sometimes failure means death. But in the case of writing software, well, that didn't work. This is why. Now I fix it. And then after you've gotten into this a bit, trust but verify. So that's a pretty loaded phrase in a lot of contexts. But here, I trust people to be able to write good code, but I verify it. Okay? And this is particularly once you start getting onto a larger team where you might not be the single person doing all the code reviews, because that sucks. And also other people need to learn how to do that. But I definitely am going back and looking at everybody's commits. And that might just be like 5 minutes at the end of the day, hey, what happened today? Which is what's happening right now while I'm here. 12-ish hours different, 15 hours different, something like that. Obviously, I'm not going to be involved in the day-to-day as much, but I can go look. I can file bugs. Yeah, which kind of flows right into this. Your time is no longer only yours. I'm sorry. So human beings, we tend to work really, really well uninterrupted. Yeah, the multitasking thing's a myth. It doesn't work. It's a pile of crap, whatever you want to call. Context switching for humans is really, really expensive, right? I think there's a study out there that's like, once your concentration's been broken, it takes you something like 15 minutes to get back into what you were doing. But here's the thing. When you're a manager, when you're mentoring someone, even if you're not the manager, so one of the things I liked in Donna's, was anybody here for Donna's talk earlier? Okay. Yeah, one of the things that I liked about Donna's talk was she said, you know, leadership is not necessarily granted. Anybody can be a leader. So you might not be the manager, but you might be the person that somebody's coming to. You're going to be interrupted, and it's going to be at the worst possible moment. And that's just the reality. Okay? If you're leading people, this is your new normal, and it's one of the hardest things to deal with. So, my lead developer, Chris, he gets out to the client in the morning. We're out in the suburbs. It's awful. But I drive him back into the city in the afternoon because it gives us time to catch up, and it gives me time to continue my mentoring relationship with him. And he said, you know, this is really hard. Like, it's really hard for me to stop what I'm doing and answer a question. And I was like, yep. There we are. It's one of those things where as developers, and especially as young developers, we go, oh, is it time for lunch? Oh, is it time to go home? Right? But as leaders, as managers, as mentors, we can't do that. Okay? We have to be willing to make time. Mainly because if your junior developer asks you a question, they're blocked, or they think they are. And they need your answer to help them proceed. Okay? So you have to give it to them. So the challenge for you is to be more organized, right? That's the way you don't solve this by not answering the question. You solve this by being more organized yourself. Maybe you don't get to take as much on. So I saw a tweet, I was sitting in the Hong Kong airport a couple of nights ago. I saw a tweet that said, if I were building a team from scratch, I would hire one senior developer, 4 junior developers, and the senior developer would not be able to commit code for a year. Oh, that's good. It's a shame I already finished my slides. I could have put that in there. But that's the idea. The idea there is the senior developer is going to be mentoring those junior developers, and they shouldn't have time to write code if they're doing it right. Also, then the junior developers really learn how to do all that frameworky stuff. And then lastly, it's okay to put off a question. So here's the thing. We all have deadlines. So for example, I joked earlier that most of what I do now is make decks. Sometimes that deck has a deadline, and I have to do it. And I have to say, hey, look, I have to finish this. Can you come back in a few minutes, or can you come back or I'll ping you when I'm done, or hey, have you thought about this, right? Sometimes it's one of those things where I know exactly what the answer is. It's going to take me 10 minutes to explain, but I can point them at the right Google search. Or I say, hey, just stub it out. I'll come help you in a minute. And stub it out, move on, right? So in .NET in particular, we have some really nice ways to handle this, because if you're following all the Microsoft-y best practices, we have a dependency injector, we have interfaces. You can mock out a method to just return whatever you need it to return. Like, okay, well, I know this needs to return this. I don't know how to get from A to B, but I know what B needs to look like. I'll just return B. I can keep going. And then, 10 minutes later, when I finished my deck and emailed it off and realized there are still 2 wrong dates and a spelling mistake, I can go help them. And that kind of gets into this corollary here, which is trust me. So there are things that are not going to be explainable in a reasonable amount of time, either because of complexity or the time sensitivity of the task, or because you've tried to explain it 3 times and they're just not getting it, and you know what? Just do it, we'll move on, we'll come back. And in these cases, saying trust me is okay, as long as you promise to explain at a later, potentially less stressful date. And that's important. It's important to follow up on that, because that's another place where you're building trust. Otherwise, when you say trust me, they're just going to go, well, he's grumpy, I'll just do it his way, and nobody learns anything. This is hard because you're going to want to make sure, especially if you're following all the earlier stuff, you're going to want to make sure that they understand, and they're going to ask for explanations. So there are some things that are like, I had this with, so I have a client counterpart on the current project who comes from the Java world. Nothing wrong with that. It's the right tool for certain jobs. And he's very used to the Hibernate JPA style of you register your repositories as singletons. If you do that in a .NET application, you're going to have some really, really fun Heisenbugs that maybe only appear under load. But somebody's going to be able to replicate it like once in debug, and they go, oh, nope, I don't got it. So we had this conversation because I had to go back and fix a whole bunch of his registrations because he had registered a whole bunch of things as singletons, and I said, well, no, these have to be scoped. And he's like, well, I don't get it. And I was like, trust me. And then I sent him a link about why that is. And he was like, well, why is Entity Framework not thread safe? And I said, if you find out the answer to that, I'll buy you a beer. However, doing this should be the exception, not the rule. If you always say trust me, all you're doing is creating a coding monkey who only knows how to implement things one way, which is yours for the current problem at hand. And that's a problem. Because 1, you're not always going to be their manager. 2, they're not always going to be solving the current problem. And 3, you've just eliminated critical thinking out of the equation, which could be a problem. Because eventually that's how we get the, well, this is the way we've always done things. But why? And so some examples, why we use certain patterns. So for example, why you don't want to use the dependency injection container as a service locator. Just don't do it, I'll explain later. Why the ORM is doing what it's doing. At this point I can say, well, if you're really interested, here's the source code. And framework oddities. So async await in .NET, you always want to return a task even though you can return void. I had a dev ask me why. I said, well, do you have an hour to explain, or for me to explain why there's this weird framework oddity that's built to support something that doesn't even really exist anymore, or can you just trust me and I'll send you a link to read on your train ride home? They went for the train ride home. There are some things we don't want to do when we're mentoring people. Okay, I've covered a couple of these. Don't assume. Okay, don't assume that knowledge. Don't assume they have it or they don't have it. Okay, so this kind of falls back to that check for understanding. They might know more about the subject than you do. Probably the NOS. Don't assume understanding, right? Even if somebody says, yeah, I understand. That doesn't mean they do. Don't assume that you know them, okay? When we assume certain things about individuals, they're going to prove us wrong almost immediately, and then our trust relationship breaks down, and they're less likely to seek your counsel, listen to your counsel, do things the way that you say that you should do them. And then don't assume that someone is or is not capable of the task presented, right? So early on in that same first job, I worked with an individual who was terrible. I spent about a year fixing all of the bugs that he created. It was fun. It was not fun. But he would always come, he was also above me in the pecking order. He would always come at me with this air of like, well, you might not be able to do this. Like, well, I'm a pretty capable guy here. I think I'm going to be okay. Or another principal at my firm who has a tendency to mansplain about things. So, how many of you are familiar with Xamarin? I'm sorry. So the way that you handle UI elements is our old friend XAML, right? Which sucks. And he wanted to mansplain XAML. And I was like, so this is basically you're telling me this is like WPF. Yeah. Okay. I got it. We're good. Well, no. We're good. So likewise, don't hold your knowledge over them. It is likely that you have more knowledge than your junior developers about most software development topics. So people with university degrees, people with coding bootcamp backgrounds, the problems that you're presented there are very focused into teaching. And they're contrived, right? Like, who actually needs to build a compiler from scratch? Nobody. Who needs to understand why the compiler is doing what it's doing? Everybody. So they're going to have a lot of knowledge. It's that practical knowledge. Share the practical knowledge. Likewise, there are going to be things they know better than you do, right? So my education bridged over the introduction of LingQ, whatever you want to call it, to .NET. .NET being the language that they chose to teach programming to us, which is a bit unfortunate. So I had people coming to me in the tutoring center with these link problems, and I'm like, I don't know, I've never seen this before in my life. Let's do some Googling. That was back in the day when you Googled and you got Experts Exchange, not Stack Overflow. The thing is, nobody likes to be made to feel like they're inadequate or less than, okay? So make sure that you're teaching, not dictating. Don't tell somebody what to do, teach them what to do, okay? And so the difference there is, when I dictate, I say, okay, this is what you need to do, this is how you do it. When you teach, you say, okay, here's the problem, tell me what you think you need to do. Okay. Some back and forth. It's more time consuming. It's back and forth. Okay, how do you think you need to implement that? Okay, a little bit more back and forth. Maybe use my favorite thing, which is comments in an empty code file of like, okay, first I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, right? And then they get to fill that in. And hey, then your code's documented. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's about assumptions.
Yeah.
How do you distinguish between your assessments and your assumptions about people? Because oftentimes, even your assumptions, you think it's like a valid assessment.
Yeah, so the question was, how do you differentiate between your assessments and your assumptions?
Yeah.
So, and if I'm understanding you correctly, really the question there is, so I'm trying to ask the question a different way.
Like if I have a guy on my team and I think he operates a certain way or he knows a certain amount of stuff, like is that my assessment of him or am I making an assumption? Like, how do I?
Yeah, so I think the difference maybe is an assessment, you want to base that on actual information, what you've actually seen. So if you've seen that individual perform over a certain period of time, that now becomes an assessment. Now, that doesn't mean that they're limited to that, but it's a bit more valid, right? Because there's some science behind it, observation, hypothesis, you see the results. I would say that where the assumption comes in is where you don't have enough information to make that assessment. Does that make sense? That
Yeah, it does. I'm just kind of left with like, how do I tell? I think there's another way of putting the question. How can I tell if I'm making an assumption about something?
So.
I'm starting to really doubt myself now.
Yeah, no. Well, so that's the thing, right? Is how do I tell whether I'm making an assumption? This is sort of one of those self-fulfilling. So in a very glib way, it's if you think you're making an assumption, you probably are. But to get a little bit more deep into it, a little bit more useful. The way to tell if you're making an assumption is if you come to a conclusion and you don't test it at all. You don't, like, so say I assume somebody doesn't have some knowledge or something, or doesn't know how to complete a certain task. I'm going to go test that assumption, right? I'm not just going to assume and assign the task to somebody else. I'm going to say, okay, this is something that I might be assuming. I'm going to give them the task. I'm going to challenge them to complete it. I'm going to give them the support. Now, if it becomes very clear at the beginning that they have no idea what they're doing, well, now it's not an assumption. That was accurate. But if it's clear that they do know what they're doing, and they are able to complete the task or whatever it is, well, now I've proved that, okay, well, that was an assumption, and I was incorrect, and I can move forward. Does that make you feel a little bit better?
Yeah, what I can hear in that is that like assumptions are kind of like conclusions, or they might show up as conclusions, whereas assessments are kind of more like a hypothesis or this could be true. And
Yeah, precisely.
I also feel like, in a way, it's not, you don't really have to assess or assume the other person with like no communication whatsoever. I mean, potentially there are times you could just ask the other person, and then you got to have a conversation based on that and their feedback. Maybe you can then it then basically could kind of validate what you thought or completely invalidate what you thought, right?
Yeah, and I think, so I apologize because you're exactly right. And I think that was possibly implicit in my answer rather than explicit, is yeah, definitely talking to people. Like if I have an assumption, now there are certain things that human resources people would like us to be a bit careful about. But at least where job skills are concerned, yeah, absolutely ask them. Ask the question, ask it in a way that, so there are ways to ask questions where you're not going to like open questions, right? So, hey, explain to me why we'd use CQRS here. And then you're gonna know pretty quickly if they understand even what CQRS is, and if they do, promote them, right? So, all right. This is the last thing here. Don't get angry when your team is present, and this is hard. So one of the most destructive things you can do is get angry at an individual. And it's not just like out and out, like our picture of somebody screaming and ranting and shouting. That can come to a level of disappointment and expressing that disappointment. So I had it's the same, this food safety testing project, same junior developer, and I told everybody on the project, because we had some client resources as well, hey, do not force push. We're using Git. Don't force push. Don't force push, don't force push. Do not force push. And I just sort of assumed, like, well, everybody's got that. And then we were headed up towards a release, and QA came back and said, hey, our regression tests keep failing. At least we had regression tests. I went, okay, well, that's a bit strange. I went and looked into it, and it turned out that junior developer had been force pushing for like 4 weeks. And he had been force pushing without pulling first. And so thankfully it's Git, so we didn't lose the changes, but they weren't present in the develop branch either. And man, was I upset. And I thought I did a pretty good job of controlling my temper, which I did. But our Scrum Master later came over to me and said, hey, he feels pretty bad about this, and your attitude isn't really helping it. Turned out that I was expressing my disappointment a bit too strongly. So I had to go back and say, hey, look, okay, nobody died. Code never got to production. Nobody died. Nobody lost any money yet. It's okay. Everybody screws up. Okay, we're all human. But it's a really good reminder to me of this. Like, look, you can't get angry in front of your people. Because they will screw up, but you will also screw up, and maybe they do get angry at you. If they do, I'm sorry. But we're all human. Most of us are lucky enough to work in fields where the worst thing that happens is your farm loses some money. Sometimes it's a lot of money. Some of us work in fields where somebody does die as a result of a screw up. That's bad.
Did you disable force pushing?
Yeah, so the question was, did it disable force pushing? Unfortunately, no, because our client wouldn't let us. Apparently it's useful or something.
That's the point.
Yeah. So treat screw-ups as learning opportunities, right? Give constructive feedback, help them understand what to do different the next time. Usually they're going to be able to tell you what they should have done different, right? Usually when someone sees the results of their screw-up, they pretty accurately and quickly assess, well, this is what I should have done differently. And then later when you're with your friends and away from the team, you can be upset, you can drink a couple of beers or ciders or whatever, particularly if you ended up with extra work, because unlike what I said earlier, I went against my own advice and I fixed that problem because it wasn't easy. So, real quick summary. Develop your mentoring skills. Get to know your people. Check for understanding. This is really important. It's going to help avoid some of that, am I making assumptions? Use process to help the teaching and learning journey, right? Process gives us guardrails. Be okay with time sharing yourself. Know when to say, trust me, and then those don'ts. Got about a minute and a half left. So, question in the front here.
Like sometimes you try to give feedbacks within like the stand-ups or retrospectives, but try not to be like very personal so that person feels bad, right? But then you give the feedback, then that person take it really personal, and then that person will lose trust in you or like seek for your counsel or something. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so the question is how do you deal with the potential to lose trust when you give feedback in a setting where it's not meant to be personal, but it is taken personally? So I would say, and what my firm practices is we don't do that. You don't want to give specific feedback in a general setting. If you have specific feedback, now we also encourage everyone to have one-on-ones with their project leaders on a regular basis. If you have specific feedback, get that person in a room, go, okay, look, here's what's happening. This could be a huge, long conversation, even talk topic, but the basic way of handling that is say, look, here are the behaviors, or here are the things that, thanks, I know I'm over time. Here are the behaviors that led to a problem. These were the impacts. Let's talk about it. And it's what is really the strategy there is to try to avoid accusation. Try to avoid being like, you screwed up, even if that's really what you want to do. And take it a little bit more like, hey, this is what happened. Establish the facts. These were the effects. How can we fix this moving forward? Does that make sense? Okay. There's a lot more to talk about there, but anybody else in the back with the light that I can't really see?
Do you think you can still effectively mentor juniors from an architect position or an SME position as opposed to software development manager?
So the question was, do you think you can still effectively mentor juniors from an architect or SME position instead of a software development position? I hope so, because that's kind of where I am. I think it depends on how much day-to-day interaction you have. You might not be able to mentor them on specific coding aspects, but you can mentor them on architecture. You can mentor them on the domain. Or, depending on your role on the team, maybe you do get to mentor them on the development piece as well. No one gets to be no one has a single mentor, right? I think that I have to finish up so that everyone can get to lunch, but I'd be happy to talk to anybody who wants to come up and talk to me here.